You know, I grew up in country like this. My dad and I would ride our horses up to these amazing high mountain lakes. We'd ride back into some pretty remote wilderness areas with incredible streams and meadows and wildlife. I love it here. Look at this canyon. It reminds me of the Grand Canyon. You've got this little stream, you've got these steep canyon walls. How long do you suppose it would take for a stream this small to remove this much material and cut the canyon this deep? This rock has a history, just like I do and just like you do. It came from somewhere. A lot of these rocks have been dated to be 350,000 years old, up to 2 million. That's pretty old. But it might surprise you to know that all of the geological formations that we see here, the canyons, the layers, even the plants, are younger than I am. When I was born, there was nothing here but a vast forest, hundreds of feet below where we're standing right now. In fact, before 1980, most people had never even heard of Mount St. Helens. It was in that year, on May the 18th, that molten rock created a steam blast with a force of 20 million tons of TNT. Avalanche debris and other flows from the eruption laid down all of those layers rapidly, up to 600 feet thick. A couple years later, there was some more volcanic activity that created a mud flow that cut out this entire canyon. It also cut through deep bedrock, all in a couple days. Isn't it amazing what a little bit of information from the past can do to help change your view of the present and the present world around you? There are a lot of assumptions made by a lot of people about the history of the earth around us. The question is, how do those assumptions affect how we view that history? But more importantly, how do they play into how we view science and the Bible? Did God create the world in a few days or billions of years? Is mankind descended from apes, or did God create us instantly in his image? Was there a global flood that destroyed the earth, or is that a myth? In other words, is Genesis history?
And the reason why the millions of years are important, if we go back in the history of scientific thought, Charles Lyell in England proposed millions of years, and they multiplied the ages for the rocks. And that was the foundation on which Charles Darwin built. In fact, he read Charles Lyell's book and was convinced of the millions of years of geological evolution, so he could say, now, given enough time, what we don't see happening in the present. We might only see small changes in the present. Given millions of years, the small changes can add up to big changes. And so if you want to have a way of looking at the history that says that we got here by chance, random processes over millions of years, then you've got to have rocks that are millions of years old. Otherwise, you've undermined that whole foundation of that view of Earth history.
So time becomes the critical element for the conventional paradigm.
Exactly.
And that time has to be deep time. Andrew said when you study the rock formations, they show evidence of a young Earth transformed by a global catastrophe. So he took me south to Sedona to see it for myself.
The important thing to note is that this landscape is actually very stable. There was lots of erosion in the past to carve out this whole terrain, but those cliffs and the valley floor are very stable, which is why you've got the vegetation. Today, everything's much, much quieter. Today's processes are extremely slow, but they can't explain how we got this erosion, how we got these layers, how we got these cliffs.
All right, so you wanted to come here because you see evidence of a young Earth because of what's here. What do you see?
Yes, well, the first thing we notice is the extent of these layers. It's like a stack of pancakes. For example, the red unit that goes all the way across our field of view, that's the Schnebly Hill Formation. And above that, you can see the first white unit is the Coconino sandstone. And above that, you've got the Turaweep, and at the horizon, you've got the Kaibab limestone, which is the rim rock of the Grand Canyon. And, you know, here we are, 70 more miles from the Grand Canyon, and these layers are still here.
Yeah. It's almost hard to imagine the volume of material that represents.
Yes, take the Coconino sandstone. We can trace it from here, right across New Mexico, Colorado, right over towards Kansas and Oklahoma, and even in Texas. We're talking at least 200,000 square miles for this one rock unit that's consistent for mile after mile after mile. That's not the scale that we see today with localised sedimentation. And to get it flat lying like this over such a large area, it's like you have to make your pancake all at once very rapidly. And so these layers show evidence of rapid sedimentation, the extent of these layers.
Well, Andrew, you were talking about that red formation, but that doesn't sound familiar to me.
No, that's the Schnebly Hill Formation. It's not in the Grand Canyon. In the Grand Canyon, we go from the Coconino into the Hermit Formation. There's that knife edge boundary, and there's no evidence of erosion there, which means that the Hermit Formation was rapidly deposited, and then immediately the Coconino was a deposit on top of it. But here, we've come 70 miles from the Grand Canyon, and we've got this Schnebly Hill Formation between the Coconino and the Hermit. And this Schnebly Hill Formation, 800 to 1,000 feet thick, over an area of 1,000 square miles, had to have been formed very rapidly. If that took millions of years, we ought to see millions of years, evidence of millions of years erosion back in the Grand Canyon at that same boundary. We don't. So that means that this Schnebly Hill Formation in this area had to form in a matter of hours. So it tells you that not only is there a lack of erosion, but there's no time between those boundaries. So the whole sequence of layers was very rapidly deposited.
So we have this large extent of layers. We have the lack of erosion between the layers. What other evidence do you see?
Well, if we look closely, for example, at the Coconino sandstone, we see the bedding, that there's bands within it that are sloping. We call those crossbeds. What they indicate is that you had underwater sand waves were moving along. The comparison is in a desert. It's important to recognise that there's a difference in the angle in a desert dune. It's usually 30 to 34 degrees of these sloping beds. Underwater, it's usually 25 degrees or less. And Dr. John Whitmore has combed the hills around here with his students, hundreds and hundreds of measurements of these crossbeds, and they all come in the range of 15 to 25 degrees. So it was underwater deposition. And so these layers are accumulating in hours, weeks, and within months, you've got this whole stack of pancake layers over such wide areas.
So it isn't a difference in believing in those layers that exist.
Not at all.
It's the difference of time, isn't it?
Correct. It's not a question of science versus the Bible. When we're talking about the flood paradigm and the conventional paradigm, we're actually talking about two different views of Earth history.
Those views really are different. Of course, I grew up being taught the conventional view with its long ages and slow, uniform changes. But what was the history of the world according to Genesis? Kurt Wise took me from one fascinating place to another, showing me evidence of fossil forests, explaining the rapid formation of coal, and talking about the complex design of biological systems. Everywhere we turned, he showed me something new about the Earth and its history. We ended up at the entrance to an old abandoned coal mine.
This is leftover remains of the Dayton Coal and Iron Company, built about 110 years ago.
Well, what's amazing is that if you didn't know that history, and if you looked at these rocks, you would think they were very ancient. In fact, if we were in Greece, we might think they're thousands of years old.
It's hard to tell just looking at the structure itself.
Well, Kurt, then I need for you to do something to me, because I know that the conventional paradigm looks back in Earth history, and it's a straight line. A lot of uniform processes and so forth. But the Genesis history is telling us that it's not that uniform.
Yeah, that's a good point. In 2 Peter chapter 3, it talks about people in the latter days saying, where's the promise of his coming? For all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That concept that what you see in the present, what's happening right now, what's happening in the creek down below, what is happening in every place on the earth, is the way it's always been. It's always been for all of earth history. The passage goes on to say, for this they are willingly ignorant. They're not just ignorant of these truths, they're purposely rejecting these truths, and it lists the creation and the flood. These are apparently events, according to the Bible, that aren't like the present.
Right.
And the neat thing is, that's what we see here. That cliff isn't actually in place. That cliff belongs about 1,000 feet up. It's slid down to its current location. That's a pretty big boulder.
That's huge. That's
okay,
massive.
now what kind of process in the present slides blocks that big down? This thing continues for a mile. But inside those rocks are yet further evidence of an event before that that's even bigger, even more unlike the present. And then inside those rocks are also fossils of a time period that's very different than the present. So that, according to the claims of Scripture and according to my own experience, you can't use the present to judge the past, to understand the past. But if you go all the way back to the beginning, you realize that the Bible lays out what I would call epochs of Earth history.
Major periods of time.
Just different things happening during each of these epochs, that if you lived in any one of the other epochs, you would never understand the previous epoch, because it's so different. The first one is the creation itself. In 6 days, God created the entire universe. He created the planets and the stars, and he stretched out the universe with his outstretched arm. That's obviously not happening today. He's not creating planets. In fact, at the end of that passage, he says he ended his creation work. Then we move into what I call the Edenian Epoch, the period of time when Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. And it's very different than the present. We get the impression from that passage, for example, that Adam and Eve, if they had not sinned, would have lived forever. It's hard to even conceive of human beings living forever. So it's a different world, wildly different. How long it lasts, we don't know, but it suddenly terminated with Adam and Eve eating of the tree of the knowledge good and evil,
rebelling,
and God cursing the creation. He changed the rules in the universe. Now no longer is the sun going to be able to burn forever. No longer are we going to be able to live forever.
So it's hard for us to even imagine what that would be like, because we only see the laws are...
And we wouldn't have come to that conclusion if we didn't have the Word of God.
We didn't have this...
And that's what I think the Word of God has been given to us for. So we slide into the third epoch of time, what I call the antediluvian period, the period before the flood and after the fall of man. It's a world that's different than the present. It's got the same natural laws going on, but it's a different set of critters, different set of plants. It's a little bit warmer Earth. The continents are in different positions from what they are now. It looks significantly different.
Well, that's what we see in Peter, where it talks about that world being destroyed. So the flood was not just soaking everything. This is radical change, wasn't it?
Yeah, if we're right about what we've understood so far, we got continents moving, smashing together, creating mountains. Mountains are rising to tens of thousands of feet. You've got water washing across entire continents. We're ripping thousands of feet of sediment off of the old continents and then depositing thousands of feet of sediment on top of them again. We're looking at earthquakes of astonishing power.
So this change then from what you call the antediluvian epoch now into the post-flood.
Basically, the Earth has got to recover from a global flood. The atmosphere's got to recover, the geology, the rocks have to recover, plants and animals have to spread across the Earth. You got lots of water, humongous earthquake, humongous volcanoes, and more or less that period of recovery is a slow decrease in intensity and frequency of those things.
So would it be in that period that we would see the Ice Age, for example?
Yes, that's ironically, the Ice Age turns out to be, in our modeling, a consequence of the heating of the water during the flood. Water is evaporating off the oceans, that cools the oceans. The water is then moving over the continents and dropping enormous volumes of water. Now, in certain places, the rain's going to come down as snow, but coming down so rapidly and without break that it can't melt and accumulates into thick sequences of ice until they're miles thick. And then when the oceans had cooled enough that that rain generation system had stopped, then those glaciers then collapse under their own weight, melt back to the current position, and they're continuing to melt. You know, this thing, global warming, it's recovering, the Earth is still recovering from the flood.
So that was really a fairly tumultuous era right then, but then you have one final epoch.
So the modern epoch is, you can study present processes and understand things fairly readily back to within a couple centuries of the flood.
And so that would lead one to think that these processes, if you take them all the way back...
Precisely.
Right.
You take the present processes and extend them into the back. And that's what 2 Peter says. That's the error people make. It's reasonable. Take the present and extend it into the past. Not unreasonable. So you need to go to the Bible to find out the necessary information to reconstruct it. And looking at it the other way, if you start from the Bible, you only get the beginning of the story.
Right.
God has given us the ability to read the rocks and fill in the rest of the story. And we need to fully understand the flood, we start with the Bible, but then we go to the rocks. Speak to the rocks and they shall tell you what has happened in the past.
So when I'm thinking about these types of creatures, I'm thinking about a world that's right before the flood.
I mean, this is a real picture of a violent world.
That's why God said, behold, the end of all flesh. It wasn't just mankind. Man and all of the animals over which we rule are judged at the time of the flood.
Well, Marcus, can you kind of give us an overall picture of the fossils and how all this stuff fits together?
Yeah, fossils tend to be found in distinct layers where there are very, very large numbers that have been destroyed, untold billions. And so every time we see a layer of rock that's this thick, we're thinking about an event that probably took minutes to make, not thousands of years, minutes for just this one package of rock, sometimes even seconds, where these pulses of water from the flood are moving over the continents, grabbing ecosystems or dragging marine ones up from deeper in the ocean, and pulling them onto land. And as one gets deposited and the waves come back, they start pulling and piling additional stuff on top of that. And it's a graveyard on top of a graveyard on top of a graveyard. It's the sort of thing that speaks to catastrophe, not the sort of thing where the fossil record is gradually accumulating bone by bone, shell by shell, little by little, over untold eons of time.
So you're saying that we have these marine fossils all over, even on mountains?
Yeah. You know, further back over in the museum, they've got sections with things like mosasaurs, these big swimming reptiles. Mosasaurs are globally distributed, and they're distributed on continents. So looking at these things, you're saying, what is it that has the power? What is it that has the capacity to take the marine world and throw it on top of the continents in such a violent and destructive manner? And the flood makes perfect sense for this.
When we were in the Grand Canyon, we saw that great unconformity. And there were no fossils to speak of really below that. And then all of a sudden we start getting a lot. What does that say to you as a paleontologist?
Well, the great unconformity is telling me that there's some sort of massive erosion and shearing that's happening across the continent. And then once we start getting to those nice sedimentary rocks that have all the wonderful fossils in them, the pattern starts to emerge. The ecosystem that has the first animals in it shows up very suddenly. In conventional paleontology, they call this the Cambrian Explosion. It's the first appearance of a wide diversity of different types of marine animals. All of a sudden, you have this complex and whole ecosystem that shows up basically out of nowhere. Now, that makes perfect sense from a creation and flood perspective because the flood is about destroying ecosystems. Whereas in an evolutionary view, these ecosystems are going to have to arise a little bit more gradually as organisms diversify and evolve and respond to one another in their environment. But that's not what you see. Instead, you see an explosion of life that is complex, whole. The ecosystem is integrated with one another. You can see where all the different organisms fit with respect to one another. And that's just the first time that that happens. every time you move up in the geological column, in this fossil record, you start seeing snapshots of more and more ecosystems. You've got one ecosystem that's destroyed, and then you've got another one. It's got slightly different creatures, there's different interactions going on, and as the floodwaters move higher and higher, they're getting closer and closer to shore, destroying more and more organisms in the shoreline and eventually up onto land.
Yeah. So I think I see what you're saying here, and that is that the paradigm that we're all taught, that conventional paradigm, is trying to tell us that the fossil record is an evolutionary picture of life as it is developing, as opposed to the Genesis paradigm that's saying, no, all of that life, all the complexity of life already was there, and now we're looking at the graveyard of all that life.
Exactly.
Well, what are some of the other data that you're seeing that convinces you of this paradigm?
Sure. Well, one very curious situation with the fossil record, so thinking vertically about things, is not the hard parts of the animal, but the trackways. They're the footprints. This is a pattern that we see in several different groups where their footprints are first and their body parts are later. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record, it's from trackways, not the hard parts. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because you have millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. But that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized? Instead, the pattern's telling us something different. There's no time between when somebody leaves a track and when somebody gets buried.
But the fact that those trackways are still there, that should tell us something as well, shouldn't it?
One, it tells us that the deposition or the placement of the next layer on top of them had to happen very, very quickly. Because again, you go out onto a beach and you walk in the sand, your trackways are destroyed very, very quickly. But the fossil record is showing us something very different from today. This is death in a moment, right? This is death in an instant. And we're talking about a world that was complex, whole, integrated, and the flood is destroying that world sequentially and burying it in a vertical fashion. And so I think looking at the fossil record as a record of life is partly correct, but it's not about life's development. It's about life's attempt to survive an event that ultimately consumed all of them.
Well, that would make sense then, because when God was talking about destroying the earth with the flood, it wasn't just the destruction of human life, it was the destruction of all life. And so now the world we live in is, as you said, radically different than what that was before.
Yeah, when we look at the T-Rex, when we look at the mosasaurs, when we look at all these animals as ferocious carnivores, and they really are, I mean, they're terrifying, but that's not what they were initially created to be. And so these sharp teeth, these devastating claws, and the behaviors that go along with them all seem to be part of the curse. And part of that is genetic, part of it might also be just some modifications, but these organisms, by the time we see them, and this is important for us to remember when we come to a natural history museum, is you're not seeing the world at creation week. You're seeing the world as it existed at the flood. And that world was one that was filled with violence and was a pretty terrible place to be.